Welcome to Cryptographics, the channel where we take the most popular topics in Bitcoin and explain them with infographics. So today we are talking about why governments will not ban Bitcoin. And here is today's graphic. Big hat tip to Robert Breedlove and Parker Lewis for the inspo and the info here. They won't ban Bitcoin because one, it's unenforceable. There's legal precedent that it would not be allowed to ban it. It's already too adopted to fail. There's heavy incentive to cooperate with Bitcoin, and there's already evidence of governmental support. So let's go into each one. And the reason why this is a hot topic right now is because famous investor Ray Dalio recently said, this is a few weeks ago, he says, if Bitcoin becomes material, governments won't allow it. I mean, they'll outlaw it and they'll use whatever teeth they have to enforce that. And, I think this is a concern that everyone who's considered Bitcoin has at least thought of this at one point in their journey. So let's talk about why it is unenforceable. And let's go to our man, Robert Breedlove.
In the body of the rule of law. Even if they did that, even if you overturn freedom of speech, outlaw Bitcoin, the ban itself is virtually unenforceable, right? Bitcoin is just this lightweight software client running all over the world. There's no way to tell who's running it and who's not. You could try and target some of the mining operations, but we've seen this attempted in China. Miners just move, right? These little rigs are small modular design things. You put them in a box, you ship them elsewhere, you plug them back in, you're going again. So it's a very elusive network to try and pin down, right? There is no central authority. There's no office. There's no CEO. All of these things that governments have become very adept at zeroing in on and shutting down, Bitcoin doesn't have any of those attack vectors on itself. And there's another thing that's interesting. There's a good analogy there. And this is a great analogous question for thinking about how you would shut down Bitcoin is, how would one shut down the internet everywhere, worldwide, forever, right? Like you can...
A great question indeed. And then let's go to our friend Andreas Antonopoulos, and he has some great info on why it would be unfeasible as well. He says, a lot of people think that a Bitcoin transaction has to be transmitted on the Bitcoin network. That's not true. A Bitcoin transaction has to reach the miners and be included in a block, but it doesn't need to be transmitted over the Bitcoin network. There's nothing special about the Bitcoin network. It just forwards transactions and blocks. A transaction can be transmitted over any form of communication medium. And then he goes on to say, a Bitcoin transaction can be transmitted over completely unsecured Wi-Fi, by smoke signal, by light signal, with carrier pigeons. It doesn't matter. Nothing in that message can be compromised. So he goes on to say, hey, if you want to prevent, exchanges or something like that, then people can just submit transactions directly through to miners. Via any form of communication. They could send it through Twitter. They could send it through Facebook. They can send it through Skype messages. They can encode the messages in all these communication platforms. So it's really, truly unfeasible to shut down Bitcoin. Next, there's also legal precedent against banning Bitcoin. And we'll go back to our man, Robert Breedlove. Take it away.
Or like Bitcoin. And I would encourage listeners to go look at the PGP case study. This was in the late 90s. The government was attempting to classify PGP, which is a pretty good privacy technology, that was being exported abroad. They were trying to classify it as munitions such that they could restrict its exportation. Trying to classify it as a weapon, essentially, so they could control its importing and exporting. And I'll gloss over the details of the case. There's some back and forth, but the case took a turning point when the plaintiff, I guess the defendant actually, the one representing PGP, actually printed out the entirety of PGP's source code and presented that as physical evidence. So they said, this is PGP. How do you outlaw this? This is the whole thing, all the source code, 100% of the software that we're trying to classify as a weapon or munitions is in this paper. It is speech written on this paper. And in that moment, the Supreme Court declared that PGP was protected under the First Amendment here in the United States.
Thank you. Very well said. All right, moving on. So next, Bitcoin is already too adopted to fail. At the time of this video, it's about a $350 billion market cap. It's roughly the 12th or 13th largest currency. And that's happened in the course of 12 years with no marketing, no government enforcement. And it's also become heavily adopted by publicly traded companies. So we can see that almost 4% of the current circulating supply is held by treasuries of publicly traded companies. And not to mention, if you sign into your PayPal, front and center, buy Bitcoin, and they have 326 million users. We are just getting started. It is not possible to shut down all the places that Bitcoin already exists. Next, there is a heavy incentive to cooperate, for governments to cooperate. The only way to win is to play the game. And this is masterfully outlined by Parker Lewis in Gradually, Then Suddenly, talking about the prisoner's dilemma. This is game theory. And so we can look into his article a bit. He says, and more practically, any attempt to ban Bitcoin or heavily regulate its use by any jurisdiction would directly benefit a competing jurisdiction. The incentive to defect from any coordinated effort to ban Bitcoin would be far too high to sustain such an agreement across jurisdictions. So real quick, we can look at the four possibilities. Let's say there's the United States, and here is another country. In the bottom right quadrant, both of them choose to accept Bitcoin, and Bitcoin wins. In the top right and the bottom left, one of them tries to ban Bitcoin and the other does not, and that leads to capital outflows away from the country that's trying to ban it and the capital inflows into the country that's accepting it. And then let's say somehow they do coordinate and try to both ban it. We've already covered how it's unfeasible, and so Bitcoin is still going to win and fiat currencies deteriorate more rapidly. Moving right along, there's also plenty of evidence of support already coming from the United States government. For this, we'll go to essentially the COO of the OCC, Brian Brooks, and let's hear what he has to say. This is just a couple days ago.
So believe me, there's going to be very positive messages coming out. At the same time, it's a dangerous world out there. We have to be honest about that. But nobody's going to ban Bitcoin. Nobody's going to ban some of these transmission technologies. I think it's going to be a lot less bad than people will worry about.
Love it. And then also, Cynthia Loomis is a new senator in Wyoming, and she is a huge Bitcoin proponent. Let's listen in.
And do you hope to bring Bitcoin into the national conversation?
I do hope to bring Bitcoin into the national conversation. I'm a former state treasurer, and I invested our state's permanent funds. So I was always looking for a good store of value, and Bitcoin fits that bill. Our own currency inflates. Bitcoin does not. It's 21 million Bitcoin will be mined, and that's it. It is a finite supply. So I have confidence that this is going to be an important player in stores of value for a long time to come.
Boom, boom. All right. Last but not least, let's check out what Ray Dalio had to say in his recent Ask Me Anything. This came out a day ago. This is roughly 2 weeks after he voiced his concern about governments banning Bitcoin. He says, I think that Bitcoin and other digital currencies have, over the last 10 years, established themselves as interesting gold-like asset alternatives with similarities and differences to gold and other limited supply, mobile storeholds of wealth. So it could serve as a diversifier to gold and other such storehold of wealth assets. So he's coming around. And that's a typical path for folks educating themselves about Bitcoin. We can feel confident that governments won't ban Bitcoin for these reasons, among others. I hope you got some value out of this video. If you did, please drop a thumbs up. Drop a comment if you want to add something to the conversation, and we will see you next time at Cryptographics.